Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. It's review day today and I'm taking a look at The Grace of Kings. This is book 1 in the Dandelion Dynasty by Ken Liu. So this is a book that I've been looking forward to reading for a while. It's a bit of a booktube darling, everyone seems to love it. But ratings on Goodreads aren't quite as high. I think they're sitting at 3.75, 3.8, something along those lines. But everyone on YouTube seems to love it and rave about it. It was recommended to me and indeed picked for me as one of my patron picks by author L.L. McRae, who again has really loved it. So I was going into this with a lot of hype, I suppose, a lot of expectation, but not really knowing what I was getting myself into, not really knowing anything about the story or therefore what to expect. So let's sit down and see what I thought of it. Now, if you've seen my recent January wrap-up, I did speak briefly about this one, and I said it was a very frustrating read for me, and one which was very difficult for me to, I guess, put into words, and indeed put into figures with my weighted ratings. So with this, if you've not seen before, I review or I rate a book based on certain factors. Within those we have the overall enjoyment, the characters, the world building, the plot, the writing style, the pacing, and then discretionary. I'll go through these in detail at the end of the review, give the scores and the reasonings and the total, therefore percentage that the book scored. But the way that the book was written and the way that it progressed over the course of its 640 pages did make it very difficult within pretty much all of those individual sections to give a score and certainly to compare against any other books that I've read. So first of all, this one is not a unique book. It's not a fresh, brand new storyline. It's kind of a retelling, I suppose. I have seen this described as the Chinese histories or a certain Chinese history, and forgive me, I can't remember what the actual written history of this particular time period is called, but I've heard it described as basically a reskinning of that, a retelling of it with a new veneer over the top, and that veneer is basically a fantasy setting, new names for the characters and the places and so forth. And having looked over the history kind of briefly, I can definitely see why people are saying that. I am no historian. I'm not going to pretend that I know all of the Chinese history that this is based on. I do have an interest when things like this come up, and I'll go and research a little bit and kind of look into the influences that you have. But from what I gather, from what I can see through what other people have said and what I've read through written histories as well, this is more than just inspired by, it's more than just a story that is influenced by Chinese history. It definitely does come across to me as a retelling of it. It takes a lot of factors, a lot of real historical events that have been chronicled, and it basically just repeats them here with the characters and the places changed. Now, as someone who, as I say, I'm not a historian, I'm not familiar with this particular history, that doesn't really bother me. It doesn't make a difference, because what I'm looking for is the story, and it is a very interesting, very compelling story. We're talking about rebellion, and I do like a story of rebellion, but you have two different factions basically who rise up and try to fill a void after an emperor has died. The period in Chinese history is just before 200, I think it was, BCE, and it's called the Chuhan Contention, is the kind of the overall battle between these two, or the overall campaign, several battles between these two essentially enemies. And many of the events that you see in this book, as I say, did actually take place in this Chinese history. We focus on two main characters who are essentially the two leaders of these opposing factions, and they are very compelling characters. One of them, I can't remember, and I'm not going to try and pronounce anyway, the names of the generals and emperors and so forth that any of the characters from the book are based on, but one of our characters is a very charismatic, very easy to like character who builds himself up basically from pretty much a street urchin to a position of real power, respect and love. And the other one is a very military man. He's very tall, he's very strong, he's very powerful. And where our first character kind of leads by example and has the respect of his men, this second character leads almost by fear. He has the fear of his men because he is so powerful, he is unforgiving, and he is very ruthless as well. And I think these two very different types of character, these opposing characters, I guess, not only on the battlefield, but in the type of person they are, I think they are very fascinating to have as counterpoints to each other, and I think it makes for a really exciting book in terms of the different pathways that these two characters have, and the reasons that they set out on those pathways, that they interconnect throughout the history of this book. Now, I say the history of this book because it is actually quite wide-ranging. I'm not sure how many years exactly the book does encompass, but I'm pretty sure it's a couple of decades, maybe more, it might be a bit less, but it is a wide-ranging book in terms of the travel that everybody undertakes for physical travel, but also the number of years that we as a reader pass through as well. And that does really bring me to probably what is overall the main criticism I have of the book, and many of my other criticisms actually stem from this one, which is why it's the key one for me. It's the one thing probably that I wish was different about this book, because I think that my enjoyment and certainly my ease of reviewing it and talking about it and thinking about it would be a lot better if it wasn't for this, and that's the storytelling style itself. Now, this is written in the third person omniscient, and I don't have a problem with that. I know a lot of people, they hear those words and they think, no, that's not for me. I don't have a problem because I look at the story, I look at the characters, I look at the world building, but all of those took a hit because of the way this particular story was written. And it's not the viewpoint that you're looking at, it's not the different heads that you get into within the story, it's the level of the story itself. The thing that really did it for me was that we were at too high a level. The number of years this book was set over, the number of events that we saw take place, I think was just a little bit too much for this one particular book, in my opinion. We didn't get into enough detail for any of it as far as I'm concerned. I want to get really in depth, I want to really sink my teeth into it, I get lost in the world, get really up close to the characters and to experience the battles, the political machinations, the odd little bits that happen around all of these within the world, and we didn't really get the opportunity to see and experience any of that. I did explain this when I was talking to my patrons in my weekly Patreon update video. I kind of likened it to a children's documentary on TV. We might have someone talking about this Chinese empire over the course of a half an hour or a 1 hour documentary. So they will very quickly recount key events, key battles that took place. And then every so often they'll focus in on one particular scene, and this is where in the TV documentary you'd have actors come in and actually play out the scene, rather than the rest of it where it will be infographics and maps and so forth. That's the style of writing that I really felt I had in this book. That's the kind of picture I had in my head, the comparison that came to me from what I was reading, because we would go through a couple of years worth of battle in a chapter or in a few pages, because we would just have the storyteller, the narrator, giving us the details of what happened rather than actually seeing those details, seeing those battles ourselves. So because of that, I said before, we had some really interesting characters who I actually quite liked, but I didn't like them enough because I couldn't get close enough to them, because I didn't know what they were doing. I just had a bit of an abbreviated history of them over a certain number of years, but I didn't see any of it in detail. I didn't really spend much time with them, even though I was essentially with them for 5, 10, 15 or so years over the course of this book. So it was very frustrating to me in that respect, because I felt like something else that I've seen people use to describe The Grace of Kings, I felt like this was a bit of a prologue to a series, but it's a 640 page prologue or a 640 page summary rather than an actual novel, which I was hoping to get for my 640 pages of time. Now, the world that we had here was quite interesting as well. I don't mind any fantasy setting that is based on something in our world. You have to take a basis from somewhere. You can't be completely original with your setting. That just doesn't work. We would have something that nobody recognises and can connect with. But here we had obviously a setting that is based on a China of 2000 or so years ago, and the naming conventions that we have for both people and places definitely reflect that. The fantasy elements in here aren't really very prominent. There's a little bit of magic here and there. There's a lady who can kind of manipulate smoke, and there's a couple of other little things. There's the influence of gods that you have as well. The magical creatures that you have, again, they're not really very prevalent. We have these strange birds that come down and take people away. We have these giant beasts in the waters as well, a bit like Narwhal. They are Cruden or Croden, and as part of the silk punk element that the author has kind of christened for his work, we do have things like airships, and we have battle kites, and we have essentially paratroopers, people jumping out of these airships to join a battlefield. And we also have submarines where people have essentially modelled craft on these Cruden, these giant beasts, to pass under ships, blockades that are barricading their entry onto other parts of an island, and to bypass those navies basically and go behind essentially enemy lines. And I thought that part of it was really interesting, but at the same time, nothing really new. We've seen airships, we've seen submersibles before in fantasy, even if they're not necessarily as common as other elements. But in terms of any real fantastical beasts, any real magic, they're not really very prevalent here. That's not the type of story that we've got. Now, before I get on to my weighted ratings, the final thing that I will say is regarding the plot, because I didn't have the greatest of times with this, as I said, and I will talk about it briefly within my weighted ratings. But I said that I don't have a problem with it taking influence and events from history, because I'm not familiar with that history, so it's not to me like something that I've read before or a retelling of something that I already know. That's fine, it's an interesting story, that's all I'm after. But I did find some of the choices were very strange, because where we have these written histories, we have a direct comparison. We have certain events that have been chronicled that appeared within the Grace of Kings. And some of the choices that I thought were weird were just the specific examples that we had. So, for instance, we have a character who infiltrates a party where you're not supposed to gain entry unless you've got a gift to the value of 1,000 coins. And our character doesn't have such a gift, but he infiltrates this party using his charm, using his charisma, and that's included to kind of show those attributes within this character as part of the character building, to show how likable he is, and that does work. But it's exactly the same as what happened in the actual Chinese history to this character. We have another character, I'm not going to say too much because of the spoilers, but we have a scene where the two main characters who are battling against each other, they're together at a feast, and one of them introduces a kind of a bit of entertainment, a sword dance basically, and the person he's got to dance with the swords is supposed to kill the other main character at this point. One of his men sees through it, joins the entertainment as well, and basically saves his lord's life through that. The two of them then go out to the latrines and make their escape, and basically take their army away, looking over their shoulder for pursuit that doesn't come. Again, this is something that is depicted as close as you can get, scene for scene, within the Grace of Kings. And then the last one, the most unusual I think for me, is a bit where you've got one of our leaders is leading his men. He's directed on the doorstep of a farm to where he's trying to get to. The directions are wrong, or he misinterprets them, ends up in a marsh. He ends up in a fight. He has, I think it's 28 men with him, or 28 men get through this fight and this marsh. And that's exactly the same as happens in the Grace of Kings, even down to the number of men he has with him. And I think that's kind of strange, because if you're going to take those kind of influences, why copy them directly? Why did he not have 32 men? Why did he not have 24 men? Why did he have to have 28 men, which is exactly the same number as his counterpart in real life had as well? It just seems very strange to me, and almost, I guess some people would call it lazy storytelling. I don't know that I would go that far, but it does seem to me a little bit unusual. So anyway, in terms of my overall enjoyment for the book, I gave The Grace of Kings 3 stars, because the main element of it was the storytelling for me. various aspects were really interesting. I liked the characters, I liked the world, I liked the overall storyline, but just being too far out, looking at all of this from a distance, kind of abbreviated into one book, and this is the kind of the expansive story I would maybe expect to take place over the entire quadrilogy, the entire 4 books. So it was very strange, and it ended up as 3 stars to me, basically because of that, because I couldn't get close enough to any of what I wanted to see. In terms of my weighted rating, so I said this was going to be a difficult one, and it was very difficult for me to score. The overall enjoyment, I ended up giving 14 because of those aspects that I've just gone through. The world building I thought was one of the strongest aspects, and yes, you've got the kind of the Chinese history that comes into play with this, as with various of the other aspects, but it is a unique world that we've got here. We've got the little amounts of magic and the gods that are in there as well, but the actual physical geography of the world, some of the little kind of elements that you have within that, I thought were very well done. For the characters, I gave 15 because I liked some of the characters that we had in here. I thought they were very, very good characters, very interesting. I loved seeing the interactions that they had, but I didn't see enough of them. I didn't get up close enough to them. So if they were in peril, a lot of the time I didn't really care because of the type of storytelling that I had. I wasn't close enough to them. It felt like I was just reading a summarized history of the world rather than seeing a story of the world. For the plot, again, for the same reasons, I gave 14. Overall, it was a good story, but it was just too... I kind of feel like too drawn out, but it was really the opposite way. It was too condensed. It needed to be drawn out a little bit more and for you to dive deeper within it. So although there were various interesting aspects of it, we only got a summary of them instead of getting any real detail. For the writing style, I'm not going to go on too much about it because I've said pretty much everything that I need to say, but it did score therefore 4 out of 10 for me. This was by far the weakest element, by far the one aspect that had the greatest impact over many of the other categories, but certainly my enjoyment. I have said previously that the writing style is only scored out of 10 because it's not one of the sort of real important parts to me. There are other elements that take precedence for me, which is why I have a weighted rating system. But you can see from this one, it's a really good example of how one aspect of it can have a real difference, a real impact on other categories as well. That's definitely what you get here. The pacing, because of the way that it was kind of all summarised, it was all shrunk down, it seemed very fast at various parts where I wanted to get into more detail. I gave it 2 out of 5. And then the discretionary, I've given 1 out of 5 because this UK cover, at least, I'm not so keen on the US one, but I do like this UK cover that we have, and we've also got a nice map inside it as well. So overall that gives The Grace of Kings a score of 66%, which puts it at equal 205th on my Hall of Fame. So not a very good score. Should it have scored higher? Possibly, based on my overall enjoyment of it. I'd maybe expect to see it a bit higher up the table. But there are some real key elements in here that really held it back for me and stopped it rising up that table. Now, I did say in my January wrap-up that I am going to continue at some point with this series. I have heard that the second book in the series, Wall of Storms, does change the storyline a little bit. It does converge. It takes us away from the Chinese histories. It gets a bit fresh in terms of the storytelling. So I'm hoping that's going to work a lot better for me, and I'm definitely going to go into it with an open mind and give it the benefit of the doubt and treat it on its own merits rather than this book holding it back and making me decide, no, I'm not going to read the rest of the series. So I'm not sure when I'm going to move on to book 2, but it is there on my TBR for some point in the future. That's it for The Grace of Kings and me today. Anyway, let me know in the comments down below what you thought of this book, if you've read it or if you're thinking of reading it. Where does this leave you? I'll hopefully see you in the next video sometime soon. Until then, as always, take care of yourselves, read some good books. Bye for now.